All right, get ready for this one because today we're going deep, deep into a story that's as chilling as it is complex. It's the story of Elizabeth Báthory,
The Hungarian Countess.
the Hungarian Countess known as the Blood Countess.
And our goal today is going to be to try to sift through, well, centuries of myth and rumor to figure out if she really was a monster who bathed in the blood of virgins to stay young.
Or, is there something more to the story?
Or if there's more to the story.
Yeah, was she maybe a gifted but ruthless leader?
Or was she a grifter, someone who exploited her power?
Yeah, you sent us a ton of material for this one. I mean, historical accounts, modern analysis,
Some pop culture?
even some pop culture references.
Yeah.
It's like we're prepping for a trial, not just a deep dive.
It's very true. And that's what's so fascinating about this case. It challenges us to think critically about how these narratives are shaped, who controls them, and whose voices get lost in the process.
So to really understand Elizabeth Báthory, I think we got to understand her world first. So she was born back in 1560 in Royal Hungary.
Yeah, a region that was embroiled in religious and political turmoil at the time.
Embroiled in religious and political turmoil. Oh, yeah. Imagine Eastern Europe back then. Constant wars with the Ottomans. The threat of plague was always there. And, of course, the Protestant Reformation. That was causing a seismic shift in the power dynamics.
And this context is really crucial to understanding her story because it's a world where violence and instability are just the norm, Power is often a matter of survival, not just privilege. And Elizabeth was born into, well, the powerful Bathory family.
Protestant nobles.
Protestant nobles, ties to royalty. And their influence in this volatile landscape, it really can't be overstated.
But, even within this, super elite circle, there were whispers, rumors about a darker side to the family.
A family history of mental illness, even cruelty.
Yeah. It's like this cloud of darkness hanging over Elizabeth's lineage. It adds another layer of complexity to her story.
But you have to remember, a lot of those whispers, those rumors, they emerged after Elizabeth was accused. So it's hard to separate genuine family traits from maybe strategically planted rumors designed to tarnish her image.
Makes you really question the reliability of these historical accounts, It's almost like a game of telephone, with each retelling potentially distorting the truth.
That's exactly right. And that's a challenge that we're going to face throughout this whole deep dive. Separating fact from fiction and trying to understand the motivations behind the stories that people were telling.
So we have young Elizabeth growing up amidst wealth and power, but also surrounded by these unsettling rumors. And then, at just 14,
she gives birth to an illegitimate child.
an illegitimate child.
Fathered by a peasant boy, no less.
Oh, wow.
The scandal, of course, quickly hushed up, the child spirited away. But this event, I think, speaks volumes about the rigid social hierarchy of the time and just the lengths to which the powerful would go to protect their image and reputation.
A year later, she marries Count Ferenc, a powerful and ambitious soldier.
Consolidating her position even further within the Hungarian elite.
Yeah. But this marriage, it wasn't about romance, right? It was a strategic alliance.
It was. Merging lands, titles, bolstering their power and influence. And Nadasdy, he was often away fighting, leaving Elizabeth to manage their estates, essentially ruling over her own domain.
So she's young, wealthy, and wielding a significant amount of power. And this is in a world where women were often relegated to, well, the sidelines. Talk about a recipe for admiration, but also probably resentment, right?
Absolutely. And that's where we start to see those whispers of cruelty beginning to surface.
Servants vanishing.
Servants vanishing from her castle, rumors of harsh punishments, unexplained deaths.
But at first, these whispers, they're confined to, well, the peasant class.
Yeah.
I mean, these are people she had absolute power over, right?
That's right.
But then the stories, they escalate. They become more gruesome, more detailed, and they start spreading beyond the castle walls.
People start saying she's not just punishing these girls, she's torturing them.
Burning them.
Burning them, beating them, even biting chunks of flesh from their bodies.
And this is where the truly horrifying part of her legend takes hold. The bloodbaths. The rumors claim that Elizabeth, obsessed with youth and beauty, becomes convinced that bathing in the blood of virgins will preserve her own.
And this image of the Blood Countess, it becomes central to her story, even though the evidence supporting it, it's largely based on, hearsay and conjecture.
But we do have accounts that describe these elaborate torture devices.
Needles.
Needles, hot irons.
Cages designed to slowly drain the blood of her victims.
It's a horrific image, difficult to even comprehend.
Yes. And it's crucial to remember that these accounts, they were often written, decades after the alleged events,
Yeah.
and often by people with their own agendas. So we have to approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism.
So for years, these rumors swirl around Elizabeth Bathory, but it's not until 1610 that things really come to a head. King Matthias II, facing pressure from some of the noble families, or perhaps driven by his own ambitions, orders an investigation.
And the investigation's led by Georgi Thurzo,
Elizabeth's cousin.
her cousin, adding another layer of intrigue to the story. And he gathers testimony from hundreds of witnesses,
Some describe scenes of just unimaginable cruelty.
while others focus on just the unusual number of deaths at her castle.
However, despite this investigation, the mounting accusations, Elizabeth never faces a formal trial.
That's right. Her noble status comes into play. Instead of a public trial, she's placed under house arrest in her own castle, confined to a few rooms, effectively silenced and cut off from the world. It's a peculiar ending to such a shocking story.
Almost anticlimactic.
Almost anticlimactic.
Yeah, it's almost as if the punishment, the way it was carried out, was designed not just to confine her, but to also protect the reputation of the nobility as a whole.
Precisely. And that's where that theory of a political conspiracy starts to take shape. Some historians argue that Elizabeth was a victim of a power grab, a convenient scapegoat for those who wanted to take her wealth and her influence. Remember, the king was reportedly deeply indebted to Elizabeth's late husband.
And after her arrest, that debt is just magically forgiven.
Conveniently.
Yeah, pretty big coincidence, wouldn't you say?
Indeed. It raises the question, was Elizabeth Bathory a monster, or was she simply a woman in a position of power that made her a very convenient target?
A woman who dared to wield power in a world that was dominated by men.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how even if those bloodbaths, those stories, were exaggerated or even completely fabricated, it doesn't necessarily mean that Elizabeth was innocent of, well, any wrongdoing.
No.
There are still those accounts of cruelty towards the servants.
Precisely. And while she may not have been this, bloodthirsty serial killer, it's certainly possible that she was a cruel and abusive mistress who exploited her power over those beneath her. We have to remember that power dynamics, especially in that era, could very easily lead to exploitation.
It's like even if we, debunk those most sensational aspects of her legend, we're still left with this picture of someone who may have been deeply flawed, someone who used their position to inflict harm on others.
Right. And that leads to, I think, another crucial question, why were those accusations taken so seriously in the first place? Why was there this rush to believe the worst about Elizabeth Bathory? Was she really a monster, or was she simply a woman in a position of power that made her a very convenient target for, well, people who wanted to see her fall?
It's almost like they needed a villain.
Yes.
And Elizabeth, with her wealth, her independence, and all those whispers of cruelty, she just fit the bill perfectly.
And that's a very astute observation. Remember, we're talking about a time when women were expected to be subservient, to operate within very narrow confines. Elizabeth, by inheriting her husband's lands, his titles, she defied those expectations. She became a threat to the established order.
So they needed to discredit her, make an example out of her, even if it meant exaggerating or just making up her crimes altogether.
Well, what better way to do that than to tap into these sort of these existing anxieties and prejudices? I mean, the image of a bloodthirsty countess, a woman who preys on young girls, it aligns perfectly with centuries-old tropes about female evil, the witch,
The temptress.
the embodiment of chaos.
The embodiment of chaos and sin.
They took these pre-existing narratives and just molded them onto Elizabeth, creating this monster that served their own interests. Exactly. And the fact that these accusations emerged in a time of such immense social and religious upheaval, it just amplifies their power even more. The Protestant Reformation, that was reshaping the political and religious landscape of all of Europe, and that was creating deep divisions, anxieties among people.
So Elizabeth, this prominent Protestant figure, would have been seen as like a threat by those who just wanted to maintain that old order.
Right.
She became a symbol of everything they feared and opposed.
Exactly. And her story becomes a cautionary tale, this warning against, female ambition and the dangers of challenging the status quo. And the bloodbaths, whether they were real or imagined, they become this ultimate symbol of her transgression. They transform her from just a powerful woman into a monster, an aberration that needs to be contained and punished.
It's this like stark reminder of how easily narratives can be manipulated to serve those in power, and how women throughout history have often borne the brunt of these manipulations.
Absolutely, and that's why, it's so important to approach these stories with a critical eye, to challenge those accepted narratives, and to really listen for the voices that have been silenced.
Let's talk about those voices. Were
Yeah.
there any attempts to defend Elizabeth? Did anyone speak out against those accusations?
That's a great question, and it's one that historians are still debating today. There are some accounts that suggest certain members of the clergy, particularly those who were sympathetic to the Protestant cause, question the validity of the charges against her.
But their voices were ultimately drowned out by the chorus of condemnation.
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, the political climate, the power dynamics at play, and just the sheer sensationalism of the accusations made it almost impossible for anyone to effectively defend her. She was isolated, her reputation destroyed.
Silenced.
Her voice was silenced.
It's tragic. Even if she was guilty of some level of cruelty, you know, it's hard not to see her also as a victim of circumstance, a woman caught in this crossfire of power struggles, societal anxieties that were completely out of her control.
And that's, I think, the inherent tragedy of her story. We may never know the full truth about Elizabeth Bathory, but her case serves as this powerful reminder of how easily individuals can be manipulated and demonized, especially when they challenge the prevailing social order.
It's like her story is this mirror reflecting not just the brutality of her time, but also our own anxieties about power, gender, and the stories that we tell ourselves about the past. We seem to have this enduring fascination with stories of good versus evil,
Monsters.
monsters and victims. And Elizabeth Bathory, with her blend of wealth, power, and that alleged cruelty, she fits perfectly into that mold.
That's a very insightful observation. We as humans, we crave these simple narratives, clear-cut heroes and villains.
Yeah.
But history rarely offers those kinds of neat categories. It's messy, it's contradictory, it's full of nuances and ambiguities that defy easy categorization.
And in Elizabeth Bathory's case, those ambiguities are even further amplified by the fact that so much of the evidence that we have against her is based on hearsay, speculation, and potentially coerced testimony.
Exactly. We have these very vivid accounts of torture and bloodbaths, but we also have to consider the possibility that those accounts were embellished, distorted, or even completely fabricated to serve the interests of those who wanted to destroy her.
So how do we, centuries later, separate fact from fiction? How do we approach this story with the nuance and the critical thinking that it deserves?
I think the key is to focus on the context, to really understand the political and social forces that were shaping the narrative around Elizabeth Bathory. We have to ask ourselves, who benefited from her downfall? Whose interests were served by portraying her as this monster?
It's like we're these detectives trying to piece together a puzzle from fragments of evidence, rumors, interpretations that have been filtered through centuries of bias and agendas.
Exactly. And that's the challenge, but it's also the excitement of exploring these historical mysteries. We may never have all the answers, but the process of seeking those answers, of sifting through the evidence, the competing narratives, that's where the real learning happens.
So in a sense, the story of Elizabeth Bathory is less about her guilt or innocence and more about understanding how narratives are constructed, how power can be used to manipulate those narratives. It's about recognizing that history is not this static, objective account of the past, but rather an ongoing process of interpretation and reinterpretation.
Precisely. And the more we learn about Elizabeth Bathory, the more we realize that her story is not just about her, but about the complexities of her time, the limitations of our historical knowledge, and the enduring power of stories to shape, how we understand the world.
So even though we may never know the definitive truth about Elizabeth Bathory, that journey of exploring her story, of grappling with the evidence and all of the conflicting interpretations, it's a valuable one. It forces us to think critically about the information that we consume,
Yes.
to question the narratives that we're presented with, and to recognize the ways in which power dynamics can influence the stories that we tell ourselves about the past.
Couldn't agree more. And in a world where we see charismatic figures often blurring those lines between visionaries and con artists, that kind of critical thinking is it's more essential than ever.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Elizabeth Bathory's story will continue to be debated and reinterpreted for, well, probably centuries to come.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a case that forces us to question everything we think we know about history, about evidence, and the human capacity for both good and evil.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It keeps us engaged, it keeps us questioning, it keeps us searching for a deeper understanding. It reminds us that history is not this, dusty, static subject, but a living, breathing conversation that continues to shape our present and our future.
You know, it's kind of interesting how Elizabeth Bathory's story, it's resonated, well, through the centuries. She's become almost a fixture in pop culture.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, books, movies, you name it, even video games. The Blood Countess really seems to capture people's imagination.
I think it's that mix of, beauty, nobility, and horrifying cruelty that makes her story so compelling. It taps into our deepest fears, our fascinations, blurring those lines between history and horror.
But I think beyond just the sensationalism of it all, there's a deeper reason why her story endures. You
Yeah.
know, I think it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about power, about gender, and the way history can be manipulated.
Precisely. Elizabeth Bathory's case, it's like this prism refracting light onto the darkest corners of human nature and the complexities of historical interpretation.
You know, for instance, we've talked about the lack of a formal trial,
Mm.
the potential political motivations behind her downfall, and the reliance on, well, pretty questionable evidence. Makes you wonder how many other individuals throughout history have been unjustly accused or even, demonized just to serve the interests of, those in power.
It's a chilling thought, and it just underscores the importance of critical thinking, especially when we're dealing with, historical narratives. We can't just accept the stories we're told at face value. We have to dig deeper, question our assumptions, consider alternative
It's
perspectives.
like we're detectives, right?
Yeah.
Piecing together a puzzle.
Yeah.
But we only have like these fragments of evidence, rumors, interpretations that have been filtered through, well, centuries of bias, and agendas.
That's exactly right. And that's what makes this kind of deep dive so engaging. It's not necessarily about finding a definitive answer. It's about exploring the process of historical inquiry itself, with all of its complexities and uncertainties.
So what can we learn from Elizabeth Bathory's story then? What insights can we actually glean from this, well, this murky tale of power and cruelty and this allure of the macabre, this enduring allure?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is the need for skepticism, especially when we're dealing with, narratives that reinforce existing power structures or, exploit societal anxieties. We have to be wary of stories that offer these easy answers, simple heroes and villains. History is rarely so black and white.
It's a reminder that every story has multiple sides and that the voices of, well, those who have been marginalized, these accused, silenced, those are often the voices we need to listen to most carefully.
Absolutely. And in Elizabeth Bathory's case, we have to at least consider the possibility that her voice, her side of the story, was deliberately suppressed or even distorted, to serve the interests of those who wanted to, destroy her.
You know, it makes you wonder, what would Elizabeth Bathory say if she could tell her own story? What truths would she reveal about those accusations against her, the political machinations that led to her downfall, the motivations of those who, painted her as this monster?
That's a question we can only speculate on, of course.
Yeah.
But the very act of asking it, of acknowledging that there could be alternative narratives, I think that's a step toward a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of history.
And that, I think, is the real value of, deep dives like this one. They challenge us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to recognize the human stories that lie beneath the surface of these historical events. They remind us that the past is not this fixed, immutable entity, but a living, breathing conversation that continues to shape, well, our present and our future.
Very well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the life and legend of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, who continues to, well, fascinate and horrify us even centuries after her death.
We hope you've enjoyed this journey with us into the murky depths of history, and that it's left you with a renewed appreciation for the complexities of truth, power, and the enduring power of stories. Thank you for joining us.